Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited to have this first Lunch and Learn series kicking off today. And today's event is called Regional Strategies for Equitable Climate Action in Greater Cincinnati. It's the first in our Lunch and Learn series about regional climate action that will be happening over the next few months. And I'll share more on that at the end of today's presentation. We're fortunate to be joined today by the Institute for Sustainable Communities and all of you, which looking at the registration list includes not only local government staff, but NGO leadership, resident advocates, and more. It's really exciting to see the broad coalition of folks who are interested in this work. And I'm seeing some familiar faces, but for those that I haven't met before, my name is Savannah Sullivan, and I'm the Climate Policy Lead at Green Umbrella, which is Greater Cincinnati's Regional Sustainability Alliance. We're a nonprofit based in Cincinnati that works across a 10-county region in 3 states. We're supported by hundreds of regional members, and we coordinate collaborations, events, and communications to foster a more sustainable, resilient, and equitable region. I'm going to provide a bit of background because I have seen that we have a lot of new folks joining us, and wanted to provide just a little bit of background on the collective impact model, which Green Umbrella uses to bring people together on these issues in a structured way to achieve social change. In all of our work, stakeholders define a common agenda, identifying a problem and creating a shared vision to solve it. We create shared measurements. They're established so progress can be tracked effectively. We create mutually reinforcing activities that propel the collective efforts. And we have continuous communication across the stakeholders, and we facilitate this work in order to build trust and strong relationships across participants. This makes us, Green Umbrella, the backbone organization of these efforts. And you can see here 4 of our initiatives, which are staffed efforts that work with community leaders on specific goals. Here related to buildings, food policy, orchards, trails, check them out on our website. We also convene impact teams in 4 impact areas, which act as organizing concepts to launch coordinated teams that tackle specific regional issues. You're here today because of our policy impact work, which we launched last year and is committed to working directly with local governments in their communities in Greater Cincinnati to help kickstart and accelerate climate planning and implementation. In pursuing this work with regional local governments and their communities, we seek to foster coordination across our regional institutions on sustainability and policy, and elevate these needs to state, federal, and philanthropic opportunities to draw on resources for our region. We seek to build capacity in the public sector. That means both staff and the resource access they need. Key goals from these efforts are mitigating and adapting to the wide array of existing and anticipated climate impacts, such as flooding, heat, and air quality impairment we can expect for our region. We seek to reduce our emissions and, importantly, work towards an equitable and just transition, which we will hear more about from our guest speaker as he discusses regional approaches and equity. And we're kicking off this Lunch and Learn series by digging in on that first goal of enhancing local alignment and regional coordination on climate. To this end, we plan to launch the Greater Cincinnati Regional Climate Collaborative this year. It will serve as a network for public agencies to better understand regional climate impacts on their communities and advance adaptation and mitigation solutions. The collaborative will facilitate peer sharing, highlight best practices among local governments and community groups, develop opportunities for regional collaboration and program implementation, and I'm sure of great interest to all of you, help secure funding and resources in order to do this work. Network partners will also include, in addition to local government, nonprofit organizations, academia, business, and community leaders. That resident voice is a key piece of this work. Tackling these issues at the regional level and collaboratives aren't new. You can see here on the right a map of regions across the country that have collaboratives in place and have for more than a decade. But historically, these collaboratives have largely been designed and led by only government staff, which is only one voice needed to create transformative change on these issues. Green Umbrella recently led regional participation in a pilot program called the Regional Collaboration for Equitable Climate Solutions, led by the Institute for Sustainable Communities. And that took place in August, and it was a really great opportunity where we brought in some additional regional organizations to explore how to center equity in the next generation of these climate collaboratives. And as I mentioned, we plan to launch our collaborative later this year. More details on that at the end of the presentation, but we're currently in the process of convening conversations to lay the groundwork for creating a shared vision. And this is part of that conversation today. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Daniel Dickerman. He is a program officer for the Institute for Sustainable Communities US program. And particularly in his role, he works to build community resilience at the regional level. So he's a perfect match for today's topic. And prior to ISC, he worked for a Pittsburgh-based nonprofit called the Homewood Children's Village, where he managed programming related to neighborhood sustainability, public health, housing stabilization, early childhood development, and food access. So broad range of issues, much like what we experience in Greater Cincinnati. He has a strong background in network development and management, systems thinking, human-centered design, and sustainable development. And we are so lucky to be working with him through that pilot program I mentioned and their program that they launched this year called the Urban Equity Compact. So without further ado, Dan, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks, Savannah, for that very gracious introduction. Thank you all for joining us today. It's super exciting to see everybody on the line. I just wanted to give a short talk about regionalism, and specifically regionalism for governments and communities, why it matters. So what I'd really like to cover today is just some short, easy to remember frameworks about why you might be interested in regionalism or a regionalist approach as a government or as a community. You go to the next slide, Savannah. So to start with, I would like to talk about why a government might be interested in regionalism or a regional approach. And to do that, I'd like to talk about the challenges of silos. And I have 4 stories from Pittsburgh. And so, as Savannah mentioned, I'm still based in the Pittsburgh area. So I imagine that we have some fairly similar situations that we are dealing with here. And I think that these stories will be illustrative of some of the challenges of siloing and some of the benefits that a regional approach could bring. So the first story I have is concerns climate being no respecter of municipal boundaries. So we have a small municipality just north of the city. And in 2003, the municipality was hit with very destructive flooding. And so the flooding, it's sometimes hard for me to describe the scale of it, but there's this little river that runs through the middle of the town, really more of a creek. And usually it's about, you look over the side of a bridge and it's about 10 feet down and it's kind of a trickle. And during this flood, that river was 11 to 13 feet higher. And it inundated the entire main street. It just caused a significant amount of personal destruction, property destruction, etc. And so as a result of that flood, the community really launched headfirst into an eco-district process where they developed community plans around a wide range of environmental factors. They did a lot in terms of rainwater management and solar energy, workforce development, and air quality. And it was a really fantastic program in that it brought a whole lot of people together to have really important conversations. It increased the kind of broad civic engagement in that community. Unfortunately, in 2016, they were hit with another very significant flood. And same thing, it really flooded Main Street, caused a significant amount of damage. And one of the major concerns or issues for this community is that when they analyzed that 90% of the rainwater runoff that they are experiencing is coming from communities outside their municipal bounds. So they're kind of at the bottom of the hill, and there's municipalities at the top of the hill where almost all of that rain is coming from. And so even if they were able to capture 100% of the rain runoff in their community, there's still 90% of the water that they are unable to deal with because it's outside of that municipal boundary. And so when we were thinking about climate and climate impacts, regionalism is really important because where it rains, where water runs, where airflow goes, these are pieces that are not respecters of municipal boundaries. So we have to follow the impact to where the impact is, instead of saying we're only focusing on the impact in X or Y community. The next story I want to talk about is what I like to call DUI on 65. Um, and this is just a story that we tell in the Pittsburgh region. We have about the highest governments per capita in the country in Pennsylvania. And they tell the story about if you see somebody who appears to be driving under the influence on 65, which is a north-south corridor for Allegheny County, which is the county Pittsburgh is in, and you call 911, it could actually be difficult to find a police department to check out that person and make sure that they are removed from the road. Because as you are driving on 65, you're passing through different municipalities so quickly that it continually changes jurisdiction as to who is supposed to check up on this DUI situation. So really the lesson here is coordination. And so especially in a situation where you have a lot of small municipal governments, coordination is a really key element of why you might be interested in a regionalist approach. This next story is very similar. I call They Can't Even Fill a Council. I was talking to an economic development head for the county north of Pittsburgh, and he was complaining to me that economic development is very difficult because they have communities that have populations of 100 to 50 to 100 people. And so he would say they can't even fill a council, much less do much more than that. And I think that that's the third piece in terms of the regional approach, is really having this conversation around capacity. So I think with every government staff person I talk to right now, it's capacity, capacity, capacity. Everyone feels stretched and is doing multiple jobs in each role. And so the regional approach really provides an opportunity to stretch some of those resources in ways that they can't be locally. And the coordination, the stretching of resources really can lead to space that helps relieve capacity burdens on smaller local governments, especially. And this fourth story I wanted to talk about is just the idea of regional inequity. So as Savannah mentioned, the previous organization I worked with was primarily a education nonprofit. And we worked with kids to get their grades better, to get them to college. And most of our work was after school programming. And so we did some analysis of our data. One of the things we found was that 43% of our kids were starting the school each school year in a new school. And so what was happening is the parents are moving around trying to find jobs and find affordable housing. They're moving from district to district, and the kids are being moved in and out of these schools, which really limited us as an organization and our ability to have kind of a long-term impact working with these kids. And so we knew that what we needed to do is work towards stabilizing the neighborhood as a whole so that these kids could consistently go to school and we could have that consistent relationship. So the other thing that was concerning in this situation was that a lot of times, as the city of Pittsburgh was getting more expensive and housing was becoming more affordable for folks, people were moving to the inner ring suburbs, which have much smaller governments and much smaller transit systems, transit infrastructure, and much smaller social services structures. And so what we saw was people being moved from kind of the social support structure of the city of Pittsburgh to these smaller communities, and the smaller communities were really very stressed in terms of helping the population get the resources they needed. Similarly, for the city, if the city is only looking at kind of the metrics or numbers inside the city boundaries, some of those metrics and numbers might start looking a lot better as folks are displaced from their neighborhoods into these inner ring suburbs. But from an equity perspective, you're still having some significant challenges. You're just not seeing them because they're not as visible because they're outside of those municipal bounds. So from an equity standpoint, it is really critical that we continue to keep an eye on the region as a whole and not necessarily just restrain it to what's happening in our particular municipality. So moving on, Savannah, if you could go to the next slide. So I wanted to also talk about communities in regionalism and why as a community-based organization or a neighborhood organization, you might be interested in taking a regional approach. So these are different types of community regionalism, and this is from Manuel Pastor's book, This Could Be the Start of Something Big. And he lists 3 different types of community regionalism. So the first is what he calls community development regionalism. And so example of this is the transit project in Fruitville near Oakland in California. And they heard that a transit stop for the BART was going to be placed in their community. And when they looked at the plans, they saw that it was really kind of a park and ride for the BART where people could drop their cars off at a parking garage, and then they could board the public transit and leave. And so with interaction with the planners, they were able to put the parking garages further from the BART station, and then they were able to put shops and businesses in between the parking garage and the station, and we're able to actually revitalize the community in many ways by having that conversation with the planning department. And so when you think of community development regionalism, it's really this conversation around being able to leverage resources that maybe already exist and aligning processes that are happening in a way that can really benefit your particular community. The second piece is this idea of policy change regionalism. And so a lot of times policies can be written at a regional scale and have impacts at a regional scale. And so a lot of times to shift these policies, you could really want to target at that regional legislative scale. For instance, one policy that was just shifted here in Allegheny County was we banned solitary confinement in our incarceration system. And so that obviously took regional coordination and getting people to vote on that and getting that on the ballot and all those pieces. Pastor says, though, that there are some limitations to both of these first 2 sorts of regionalism. The first one with community development regionalism, there could be a concern that while a community can be in that space and be leveraging some resources, it doesn't actually create much difference in terms of the type of relationship the community has with these broader planning and development processes. It tends to be more of a one-off thing where they can get the benefits from that specific situation. But long-term, the overall situation of how communities and planning works remains largely untouched. In terms of the policy change regionalism, also, this one has some really powerful impacts in getting different policy passed, but it tends to engage kind of very specific portion of the population, which would be population who's working on getting legislation, in front of people and passed. And so again, in terms of broader engagement of a community, it can be pretty limited. So the last type of community regionalism that Pastor talks about is what he calls social movement regionalism. And social movement regionalism is regionalism that looks at concerns that are similar across a broad spectrum of the community. And that creates the sort of buy-in and groundswell that could create even more impactful change. So Pastor says that there's a number of reasons that this social movement regionalism is really important. The first reason is that a regional view can give a better understanding of the origination of a challenge. So maybe if you're in your neighborhood and you're getting flooding, it's hard to see what that is or the reason for that beyond just it's raining a lot and it's flooding. But if you're looking at a regional scale, you can start to see patterns in terms of development, in terms of how that water is being moved around or where the decisions are for where that water ends up. And so you get a better understanding of the origination of a lot of those challenges. The other thing that you can start to see looking through regional scale is unequal distribution of resources. And so a lot of times, if you're, again, kind of looking at your local context, what you'll see when you look to do a project or fund something, you might be like, oh, the resources just aren't there. But if you look at a much broader level, the regional scale, then you start to see like, oh, the resources are there. Maybe they've just been distributed over here or over here, and you can start having those conversations about a different way of distributing resources that can actually start funding some of the things that are happening at a local level. The third thing that happens is shift in the balance of power. One of the things they talk about in the book is that you could see a lot of times that for instance, development might play different communities off of each other. And so a way that might look is a developer might come in and say, we want this tax break. If you don't give us this tax break, then we're going to build over here. But at a certain scale, it becomes more and more difficult for different places to be played off like that. Because if you're starting to talk about a county or a multi-county scale, then you have to start to say, well, I won't build it all in this county or these 4 counties, et cetera. And then that really you start to have different conversations because there's a limit to how far people can build out in terms of different communities. And then the fourth thing that Pastor mentions that's really important from this regional perspective is unexpected allies. And so from a regional approach, you also run into people who you might not think have the same concerns as you do in terms of maybe, again, stormwater management or air quality or things like that. And then you can really build some unexpected allyships from doing that work and having those conversations at a larger scale. So that was a quick and dirty kind of introduction to some of the ways that people might be thinking about regionalism. And with all that, I will turn things back to Savannah.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you for that awesome overview. I think it really provides important context for why we're talking about regional climate action and is a great grounding for what the rest of our Lunch and Learn series will be in the coming months. And so what I want to share with you all today is what some next steps you can expect are. So we will be continuing this Lunch and Learn series for the next few months until the launch of our Regional Climate Collaborative on June 15th. So our next Lunch and Learn series event will be titled Building Local Government Capacity, and our guest speaker will be from the Environmental Resilience Institute, which is part of Indiana University, and they work with local governments across Indiana to build out, similar to what we're working in the tri-state area, to build out their local government capacity on resilience action. And in particular, they'll be talking about their program, the Resilience Cohort, which provides capacity through summer interns to local governments and works with communities to implement greenhouse gas inventories, design and launch climate action plans, and then implement work from those plans. And we're excited to be partnering with ERI on several initiatives. So you'll learn more about that at the March 2nd event. You'll see the registration link in the follow-up email after this event. We will, as I mentioned, be working towards launching the Climate Collaborative on June 15th. And what that will look like is kind of an elaboration on what do these governance structures provide local governments in their communities, how can leaders from across communities and across types of institutions participate and benefit, and importantly, contribute to the design of this collaborative. So in the spirit of all the work that Green Umbrella does, we want to co-create this with our communities. And so that launch will provide a lot of background information on sort of the state of climate in our region and the state of climate action in our region, and then discuss what our next steps for identifying the needs that our regional communities have, and then working together to set some goals and begin taking steps in implementation. So you'll see more on that in the coming months for what that launch event will be. And that comes right up against our Midwest Regional Sustainability Summit. So that's our conference that happens every year. This year it will be a hybrid event in person at the Cintas Center at Xavier University. And the theme is Emergent Strategies for an Equitable Climate Prepared Region. And this is right in line with everything we talked about today and the work that our climate policy impact work seeks to achieve. Our keynote speaker is Kristen Baja, who is the Chief Resilience Officer at the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. And we'll be talking about not only what resources are coming down the pipeline from the federal government to support this very work that Dan and I have been talking about today, but also what can local governments in their communities do to take action on climate. And the exciting part about the conference materials that you'll see a lot of different topics covering these issues. And this Lunch and Learn series is a great on-ramp for that work and for that conference, because after our Lunch and Learn event with ERI, we'll be hosting topic-specific Lunch and Learn, so related to energy, housing, food policy, and more. You can expect to see events rolled out through the Lunch and Learn series to dig in on specific issues. So if there is something that speaks to your community, make sure you share that with local government leaders, community actors, and more to begin planting the seed on how to take action in your communities and how the Regional Climate Collaborative can build into that. And so with that, that concludes the presentation portion of our Lunch and Learn. And I just wanted to highlight that you can learn more about the programs on our climate policy website, which I just dropped in the chat. And all of the announcements that I mentioned that are coming down the pipeline, if you want it to be aware of those, make sure you sign up for our climate policy newsletter. So I just dropped the link there in the chat, how you can sign up for the newsletter. And also you should check out our climate policy blog. That is also where announcements will be made. And if you have a story you want to share, please reach out to me. I would love to make sure that your community is being highlighted on our blog and in our newsletter. And what's going to happen next for this Lunch and Learn today is, you're welcome to wrap up. We promised 12 to 12:30 for the information drop, but I'll be hanging around until 1 p.m. To answer any questions and to field any comments that you might have of what we shared today. And yeah, thank you so much for joining. Again, yeah, happy to answer any questions. But if you need to get on and eat real lunch, I totally understand.